Well, today we start a new series that we've entitled Simplify. And before we jump into Simplify, I just want to take a moment and welcome you again to all of our campuses, especially those of you that maybe joined us for the very first time at one of our Christmas Eve gatherings. Close to 29,000 people showed up at our different Eve gatherings, and maybe you've kind of come back today for the very first time, so we just want to say welcome to you. We're real glad you're here. And then I also want to say welcome to those of you that are joining us from Emmanuel Bible Chapel in Berwick, and it's great to have you guys joining us for this Simplify series, and so good to have you along for the ride. Now, for those of you that are new to LCBC, just to kind of tell you a little bit about what happens in our gatherings, there's really two things that we concentrate on, two things that we do. One is we spend time singing, and when we sing, what we're doing is we're talking to God. And we're saying, God, this is what we love about you. This is what we appreciate about you. We're just kind of verbalizing and talking to God and saying, God, you're amazing, and we love you. And so we're just talking to God. And then the second thing we do is we allow God to talk to us. And we do that by opening up the Bible and allowing him to talk to us just about life. And the cool thing about God is he's concerned about our eternity. He's made it possible for us to spend eternity with him through Jesus. And so he's concerned about eternity, but he's also concerned about just life today. And he wants us to live life and live life well today. And so as we open up the Bible, we're looking and saying, okay, God, not only do we want to know about eternity, but we also want to know about just how do we do life well today. And so when we show up together on the weekends, and about 14,000 of us every weekend across 6 campuses, as we show up together, what we're doing is, and what we've learned over time is when we gather together, that's when we begin to grow personally. And so we show up and we open up the Bible, we talk to God, and our lives are changed, and we become lives changed by Christ. And that's who we are. And so it's great to have all of you here with us today. So as we talk about simplify, there's 3 different words that I hear on a regular basis around LCBC. It seems like more and more over the last several months. 3 words, when you look at them, they actually can be a little bit startling when you begin to think about what they mean. 3 words that kind of describe the situation that a lot of us find ourselves in right now. And those 3 words, and you probably used them about yourself, but one of the words is I feel overwhelmed. Or maybe I'm overscheduled, or I just feel exhausted. I'm just worn out in life right now. And what I don't hear are many people saying, you know what, David, I've just got too much time on my hands. I don't have anybody really coming up to me and saying, David, you know what, my life is just so smooth and easy right now, and I'm in such peace. It's just driving me crazy. And so can you give me something else to do right now? That isn't what I tend to hear. What I tend to hear is people just saying, I'm overwhelmed and I'm just exhausted. And so we're in this series that we've entitled Simplify. It's a series that we've adapted from Willow Creek Community Church. It's actually a series that we're connecting in our life groups as well, and we'll be talking about this whole concept of Simplify in our life groups. And life groups are small groups of people just doing life together, so anywhere from 5, 10, 15 people just doing life together. If you're not a part of a life group, not too late to jump into one. As a matter of fact, across all of our campuses over the next several weeks, we have these things called life group links, and it's just kind of an easy way to plug into a life group. Not too late to sign up for a life group link. Just go to the website, lcbcchurch.com, and you can sign up that way. But I would just encourage you, man, join a group. Give it a try for 5 or 6 weeks, and just don't do life alone. I think the reason why we find ourselves feeling overwhelmed, overscheduled, exhausted is we not only have the normal day-to-day business that we're involved in, where we've just got to, and we're just doing life. I mean, we've got to go to work, we've got to go to school, we've got kids, we've got our marriage to take care of, we've got our kids to take care of, we've got church, we've got the community, we've got sports, we've got all these things that we're involved in that fill up our plates. But then what tends to happen, it's not just that we deal with in life. What tends to happen is we have other things thrown in on top of us, things that are typically not planned in our lives. Things maybe like this, where maybe, you found the perfect job, it was going to be your career, and all of a sudden you find yourself without a job. You're laid off from work. Or possibly, you'd say, as I look, if I'm honest, I'm really struggling in our marriage right now where we're having a hard time. And just the struggles that you're experiencing added to the regular load that you have, it just kind of sends you over the top and leaves you feeling overwhelmed, leaves you feeling exhausted. Maybe you're having your very first child, and you thought as a couple you had it all figured out, and all of a sudden you add a 3rd person to your family and everything changes. Or maybe for you, you're just longing for that child, and it's not happening, and you're just overwhelmed and stressed about that possibility. Or Maybe you graduated from college and you're feeling good about it, but you also have thousands and thousands of dollars, maybe tens of thousands of dollars in loans, and there's no job yet, and there's not even the prospect of a job, and it's beginning to cause you to feel exhausted and overwhelmed. Perhaps finally an empty nest, you're excited, but then all of a sudden now we've got the responsibility of caring for our parents as well. Or it could be that you got a call from your doctor sometime over the last several days, maybe the last several weeks, maybe over the holidays, and you haven't returned the call yet. And they said, you know what, you just need to call us as soon as possible. And you go, I don't even want to know. Don't even want to know what's going on in that situation. Perhaps you've got just a past that's full of mistakes. Where in your life you've made a lot of bad decisions and now they're all just catching up with you and you're feeling overwhelmed by those decisions and what you're experiencing. Maybe it's losing somebody close to you. And you just take any of these things or these kind of things, you add them to the schedule that we already have, and all of a sudden you feel overwhelmed. All of a sudden you feel exhausted in your life. And when Jesus walked the earth 2,000 years ago, there's only one person that I'm aware of that as Jesus walked the earth, at least it's recorded for us in history, one person that I'm aware of that Jesus actually talked to and pointed out the fact that to him it seemed that they were exhausted. To him it seemed that they were overwhelmed. And so it's almost like he said, well, you know what? It seems to me you're overwhelmed, exhausted. We need to deal with this. And only one person that I'm aware of that he had that kind of conversation with. It was actually a friend of Jesus. It was actually a woman that he was talking to. Her name was Martha. Now, what's interesting about Jesus is when he lived, he had hundreds of followers. They would always go wherever he went, they would follow him everywhere. But even though he had hundreds of followers, he really just kind of spent his time with just a few people, a small group of friends, a small group of close friends. There was an inner circle of just three guys that he spent a lot of his time with, Peter, James, and John. But there were also three others that he spent a lot of time with, two women and their brother, Mary and Martha and their brother, Lazarus, and Jesus would spend a great deal of time with them as well. And Mary and Martha and Lazarus lived in the suburbs of Jerusalem, a place called Bethany. Bethany still exists today. And in their home, they had an extra room. They had a guest room. And they would reserve that guest room for Jesus. And so whenever he was traveling, whenever he was passing by, if he needed to get away, if he needed a break, he could just step into their guest room and kind of have some time away and some time away from the crowds. Because what happened to Jesus is the more he became public, the more people got to know about him. The more people would watch him do miracles, they would see him heal people, and so people began to want more and more of his time, and the demands on him continued to climb. And so it's as though from time to time, Jesus would call a time out, and he would just say, you know what, I'm just going to take a break. And so he would go to Mary and Martha and Lazarus' house, and he would just kind of pull back in that guest room and just recoup for a day or two. And on one particular occasion, Jesus shows up there with his friends, and I want to read to you, and I want you to read with me what actually happened in that situation. So grab a Bible. There's some Bibles around your seats if you don't have one with you. Luke chapter 10, it's page 793. Luke chapter 10, page 793 in the Bibles there at your seats. And I just want you to see what happens with Jesus in this particular visit to his friends, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And Luke chapter 10, page 793, I'm actually going to begin reading in verse 38 of Luke chapter 10. Verse 38 says this. It says, as Jesus and the disciples continued on their way to Jerusalem, they came to a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him into their home. And so what's happening is Jesus makes this unplanned visit to the home of Mary and Martha and Lazarus. Now, apparently Lazarus was not home on this particular day. Because it's an unplanned visit, then there had been no preparations made for him. There was no meal prepared. Nobody was expecting his arrival. And apparently he's been out teaching, and there have been people that have been criticizing him, and he's been busy, and so he just wants to stop. And he wants to step away from the public limelight and just kind of get away for a couple of days and hang out with his friends. So the story continues, verse 39. It says, her sister, Martha's sister Mary, sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he taught. But Martha was distracted by the big dinner that she was preparing. So Mary's there, and she welcomes Jesus into the house, and she actually pulls up a chair beside Jesus. And I can just imagine, her saying, Jesus, so glad you stopped by. It is so good to see you. And how's it been going out on the road? And what are your religious critics saying to you now? And you can tell us, Jesus, we're friends. I mean, what's said in Bethany stays in Bethany. So whatever's going on, we're just glad you stopped by to see us. And so Jesus and Mary are just kind of catching up together, and they're just talking back and forth. Martha heads into the kitchen to get a meal started, which, by the way, if you ever get the two sisters confused, you're trying to remember which one's Mary, which one's Martha. Well, Martha's in the kitchen, Martha's steward, then that'll help you kind of remember the two. But Martha is frantically trying to prepare for Jesus' physical needs. And so she's trying to figure out the appetizer, the drinks, what's the entree going to be, and she's trying to get him something to eat. All the while, Mary's just sitting in the den, and she's just chatting it up with Jesus. And after a few minutes, Martha snaps. I mean, she's really ticked. And what's interesting, she doesn't peek around the corner and try to catch Mary's eye and say, you need to get in here right now. She doesn't start dropping pans accidentally just to get attention so that somebody comes into the kitchen to say, what's going on? Do you need any help? She doesn't do either of those things. Instead, she gets really, really heated, heads into the den where Mary and Jesus are talking. She doesn't even go to talk to Mary. She goes straight to Jesus, and she just kind of unloads the way a sibling would unload on another sibling. And so look at what she says, verse 40. It says, she, Martha, came to Jesus and said, Lord, doesn't it seem unfair to you that my sister just sits here while I do all the work? Tell her to come and help me. She says, Lord, doesn't it seem unfair to you? Jesus, do you see what's going on here? Are you that unconcerned? Are you that uncompassionate? And what an uncompassionate, caring person you are. If you don't see what's going on in this situation, probably she embellishes it and says, don't you see what my deadbeat sister is doing? Because that's the way sisters would talk to each other, about each other. And don't you see what she's doing? She's sitting here, she's doing nothing, I'm doing all the work. And so tell her, Jesus, tell her to get in here and help me. And she's probably got a cooking spoon in her hand, and she's waving it at everybody, and she's waving it in Jesus' face and say, tell her to get in here now before I do something with this spoon. And if I were Jesus, I would have some ideas of what she could do with that spoon, but fortunately I'm not Jesus. And so Jesus is stopping by just to kind of unwind, relax, and now he's got this wild, crazed woman shaking a spoon in his face. And what's interesting is Jesus' reaction to her is one where he doesn't escalate the situation. He doesn't say, get that spoon out of my face. He doesn't say, do you realize who you're talking to here? I mean, the Son of God you're talking to here, do you realize who you're talking to? He doesn't say any of that. And I think it's because he understands her situation. I think it's because he knows she's stressed out. I think he knows that she's feeling overwhelmed. And see, calm people don't respond that way, and relaxed people don't respond this way. And more than likely her tank is empty, she's running on fumes, she's totally worn out. And if we were honest, my guess is that there's a lot of us here today that are kind of running on empty. A lot of us that are running on fumes, and we're feeling overwhelmed, and the tank is empty, and there's nothing left to give. And if we're not there right now, we've all been there before. We will be there more than likely at some point in the future. And probably about 4 years ago, I was in Chicago with a group of about 10 or 12 guys, and we were just kind of meeting together and spending some time together there. And at some point in the conversation, somebody brought up the fact that they were just feeling overwhelmed. They were feeling exhausted. And so everybody began to talk about, what does it feel like? What does it look like when you're feeling exhausted? And kind of how do we behave when we find ourselves being exhausted and overwhelmed? And so we started kind of looking for different words to describe it. And so as the conversation went on, somebody said, well, you know what? When I'm feeling overwhelmed, what I tend to do is I begin to feel resentment, where I look at other people and I become resentful at them, and very much like Martha to Mary, where she's very resentful that Mary is there spending time with Jesus when she's in the kitchen, and she's very much feeling resentment. And that tends to happen when we feel overwhelmed, when we feel exhausted. We begin to resent other people. Somebody else in the group said, you know what? I really become irritated very easily. Little things that don't typically set me off just set me off. Little things that happen that normally I could just kind of brush off, they just set me off. They just do something to me, and I end up with a spoon in my hand. I'm shaking it in people's faces. And somebody else said, you know what, I tend to just work harder. I just dig in deeper, and I work harder, and I just drive and drive and drive, and everybody around me is crying for mercy, but I just keep going, and I keep driving harder and harder. Somebody else said, I tend to overcomplicate things. Life that's not meant to be that hard, I tend to make it overly complicated. And it's almost like they said, I'm just got all these plates that are spinning in the air, and it's just, I'm doing everything I can to keep all of these plates spinning, and everybody else just kind of stands back and says, yikes, what's happening here? And as we talked as a group, somebody said, you know what? Pornography, it's an issue. And they said, you reach a point where you're just so exhausted that I don't feel like I've got the energy to put into a legitimate relationship, and so I turn towards pornography. Somebody else said overspending. Head to the mall, head places with credit cards, and we just kind of rack up a lot of bills. And bottom line, we all kind of said, everybody around us pays the price. When we're exhausted, when we're overwhelmed, everybody else around us is negatively impacted. Our spouses, our kids, our coworkers, our friends, everybody pays the consequences in a very negative way when we find ourselves overwhelmed. Because when we're overwhelmed, we're not at our best. When we're not performing well, we're not at our best, and it's just a negative situation for everybody around us. And this is kind of Martha. Martha's running on empty. She's overwhelmed. She's negatively impacting everybody around her, including Jesus. And she's going off on everybody. And so Jesus responds to her, verse 41, in an interesting way. Look at verse 41. It says, but the Lord said to her, my dear Martha. Now, let me just stop there for a second. My dear Martha, first century language, he's just kind of saying, come on, Martha, relax. Back the truck up. It's kind of the Aaron Rodgers, R-E-L-A-X. Relax, Martha, is what he's saying to her. He said, come on, chill, Martha. Dear Martha, you're worried and upset over all these details. There's only one thing worth being concerned about. Mary has discovered it, and it will not be taken from her. And he just says, you're worried, you're upset about all these details. You're worried and you're upset about all these different things. And notice he doesn't accuse her of anything bad. He's just making observations about her situation. And it's like he's saying, Martha, put the spoon down for a moment and take a couple of deep breaths. I can tell you're overwhelmed and you're exhausted. He said there's so many things that are occupying your mind, and they may be good things. I mean, the fact that she's in the kitchen worried about what it's going to take to prepare a meal for Jesus, that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. But he said there's so many things occupying your mind. You're all churned up inside. And he says, to be honest with you, you're making my visit a whole lot more complicated than it was ever meant to be. And I just kind of picture Jesus saying, look, Martha, can I tell you something? Whenever I stop by, what I'm looking for is friendship. Jesus says, what I'm looking for is friendship. I'm really in this for a relationship with you, Martha. And so really what I'm looking for is friendship. If I needed a meal, if I needed a 5-star dinner, he said, don't you remember just a few weeks ago, 5,000 people I fed? Don't you remember a little before that, I actually made some pretty good wine for a wedding reception. If I needed a meal, I could take care of that. But what I'm looking for is a relationship, and what I'm looking for is this exchange of love and just conversation. And so, no, I'm not going to send Mary back into the kitchen because I'm not going to have her doing things that aren't the most important things. They're good things, but they're not the most important things. They don't even make my top 10 list. And so, Martha, look, why don't you put the spoon down? Why don't you come out of the kitchen? Why don't you come in and just sit down and let's talk? Because you're running on fumes, and you're not going to be able to make it. And so put all the busyness aside, come in, sit down, and let's talk. Now, what's interesting is in this story, Jesus gives us the antidote for all of our feelings of being overwhelmed. Jesus gives us the remedy for all the feelings of being exhausted. Jesus tells us how to fix the whole situation, and it's totally counterintuitive, totally opposite of what we would think would be the fix. He doesn't say, if you were better organized, Martha, if you would organize your time better. Here, let me tell you how to organize your time. It has nothing to do with organizing your time. It's nothing to do with restructuring the way you're structuring your life. He actually just says, look, just come in here and sit down, and let's talk. And when you come in and sit down and talk, I will refill your tank. I'll be the one that refills your tank. And how long has it been since you felt like your tank was full? How long has it been since you felt like, okay, I'm not just running on fumes, I'm not just barely getting by, but I'm feeling relaxed, I'm feeling excited about life, I'm not just running on fumes. Do you even remember what it feels like to have a full tank? And the group in Chicago that I was with, those 10 or 12 guys, after we talked about what does it look like to be exhausted, we spent some time talking about, okay, what would it look like if our tanks were full? And so the kind of things that we came up with is, one, I love more. I'm more loving to my spouse. I'm more loving to my kids. I'm more loving to the neighbors. I'm more loving to people at work. I'm just more loving. I even love Eagle fans sometimes. And I'm just more open to love other people, and it just kind of oozes out, and I'm just a more loving person because my tank is full. I'm not depleted. I'm not exhausted. Make better decisions. Somehow my mind is clear. I'm able to make decisions in a way that is better than when I'm depleted. And I eat better. Better food choices as I find myself full. I'm more creative. Somehow my mind is just able to think of things that I wouldn't think of before, and so I just change the way that I think. More attentive to God. I begin to notice the nudges of God and what He's doing in my life and where He is in my life and what's happening in my life. And bottom line, I just live the life that Jesus wishes for me. I mean, what Jesus wishes for me and for us, for each and every one of us, is that we live a life in all of its fullness. In other words, we get to experience everything that He has in store for us. And it doesn't happen when I'm running on fumes. And it doesn't happen when I'm running on empty. It only happens when I'm filled up, when my tank is totally full. And so let's be honest for a moment here. I mean, I'm not asking you to raise your hand. But how many of us came in here just feeling overwhelmed today? How many of us came in feeling very much exhausted? And when you find yourself feeling exhausted, when you find yourself feeling overwhelmed, what's your natural tendency? What do you tend to do? And my guess is, our tendency is to say, well, I just need to reorganize my life. I just need to somehow get a better grip on my life. That's what I often tend to do. It's just restructure, reorganize, figure it out. We'll get through this. Some of us would say, I don't have a clue what I would do. And Jesus actually says, look, here's what I want you to do. He's talking to Martha, and He says, the only hope that you have of dealing with the resentment in your life, and you may not even know you're exhausted, you may not even know you're overwhelmed, but you're resentful, and you're resentful towards everybody around you. You may not even know you're exhausted or overwhelmed, but you're irritated at everything around you, and those are just symptoms of the fact that you're overwhelmed. And Jesus says to Martha, look, the only way to deal with your resentment towards your sister, the only way to deal with this sense of being overwhelmed and exhausted is just pull up a chair, come in, pull up a chair, sit down, and let's talk. Let's have a conversation. And in this interaction between Jesus and Martha, Jesus is talking to those of us that would feel overwhelmed, that would feel exhausted. And He says the same thing to you and me that He says to Martha. He says, you know what? Let's sit down. Let's just come in, sit down. Let me fill your tank. Only way it's going to happen. And so if you find yourself like Martha and you've got this kitchen spoon in your hand and you're swinging it and you're waving it at everybody and you're telling Jesus and everybody else what to do, and if you're all amped up about this and that, then maybe it's time for you to hear what Jesus is saying. And He's saying, slow down. Stop. Put the spoon down. Push everything aside. Come in. Let's sit down. Let's have a conversation together. And counterintuitive. Not what we tend to think. And really, we sit there and think, there's no way I can do that. I'm running on empty. I don't have the time. I don't have the energy. There's no way I can sit down and talk to Jesus. And yet what's interesting is if we're driving a car, we notice the gas tank is on empty, then we find the quickest, closest service station. We pull in, we fill up the tank, we're ready to go again. And Jesus is just saying, you're running on empty in your life. And reorganizing isn't going to help you. And tightening your belt isn't going to help you. Instead, you need to pull in, you need to sit down, let me refill your tank. And see, replenishment is only going to come. Replenishment is only going to come when we sit down and allow Jesus to refill our tank. Only way it's going to happen. Only way replenishment is going to happen is if we allow Jesus to be the one that's refilling our tank. But here's an interesting thing. While Jesus said He's the one that's going to refill our tank, it's our responsibility to come in and sit down with Him. It's our responsibility to pull the car off the road, go into the service station, fill up. We've got to be the one that pulls the car in. We've got to be the one that says, okay, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to spend some time with Jesus. It's not your spouse's job to do that. It's not your cousin Eddie's job. It's not your boss's job. It's not your parents' job. It's not my job as a pastor. It's not the church's job. It's your responsibility and only your responsibility to sit down and talk with Jesus. You don't have to refill your tank. You just have to sit down and talk with Jesus. And the only way replenishment is going to come is when we actually sit down and spend time talking with Jesus. And see, to have the kind of conversation like that with Jesus, to allow him to replenish us, means that somehow we've got to find a place that's quiet enough where we can talk with Jesus. It means that somehow we've got to put everything aside, turn off the noise in our lives, put things aside, and say, I'm actually going to sit down and talk with you, Jesus. It's being honest and saying, Jesus, I've got to be honest. I am feeling overwhelmed and exhausted in my life. I don't know what to do. I'm just here to talk with you. And then you allow him to replenish your life. And again, it's totally counterintuitive. Because in the midst of our busyness, and we say, I don't even have the time to do this. David's great idea, nice thought. I don't have the time. I don't have the energy. I don't have the place. I can't find a quiet place in my life. I can't find time to sit down in my life and spend time with Jesus. And you know, what's interesting, Jesus says it's not like it's this choice, really. If you want your tank refilled, this is the way that it happens. And it's almost like we think of spending time with Jesus as a luxury. If I have the time, it would be great to spend with Jesus. And Jesus is saying, you got to make the time because it's the only way to replenish your soul. So let me tell you how this works in my life. All my life, and I've told you this before, all my life I've struggled with just saying, okay, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to spend time talking with Jesus. Even though that I know that that's the way to refill and replenish my tank, it's always been a fight for me to sit down and talk with Jesus. So there was a period for about 20 years where my practice was probably about 5 days a week to actually spend time journaling my discussions with Jesus because my mind tends to wander everywhere. And so if I just sit down and there's nothing in front of me, then my mind just starts racing all over the place. I get distracted easily. And so I sat down and for about 20 years, 5 times a week or so, I would just journal. I would write out my conversation with Jesus because it helped me stay focused. And so I would write out my thoughts and my concerns. And so for about 20 years, that was my practice. And it was good because it helped me stay focused. But then I kind of reached a point where it's like, okay, you know, for some reason, I just grew tired of journaling. And so let me tell you what my practice is right now. And it's probably been this now for about the last 8 months. Every morning, at least 5-6 days a week, my alarm goes off at 6 o'clock. I'm not 6 o'clock in the morning. I'm not a morning person. I don't enjoy getting up early, but I, rather than stay in bed, I crawl out of bed and I kind of drag myself down to the basement and I climb onto an exercise bike. And I ride that bike for about 40 to 45 minutes, about 5-6 days a week. Now, when I first started doing this several years ago, what I would do is I would get on the bike and I would turn on the TV and I would just watch ESPN, Mike and Mike in the morning. I'd catch up on all the latest sports news, the gossip, and I love that. Sometimes I would even watch, I'm almost embarrassed to admit this, I would watch HGTV and watch House Hunters. I could get 2 episodes in that 45 minutes, so I would do that. But I'd rather just tell you about ESPN and Mike. But that's what I did for several years. And then about 8 months ago, I decided to try something different. And for me, that was very radical because I like noise in front of me. I'm the type of person, when I get in the car, instantly the radio's got to be on. Walk in the house, the stereo's got to be on. If that's not on the TV, it's got to be on. So I just like noise. And so I decided to do something that for me would be very radical. And I decided when I crawled out of bed, stumbled down to the basement, got on the bike, I would leave the TV off. No Mike and Mike in the morning. No music playing, just me, the exercise bike, silence of the basement, and I decided, okay, I'm going to take this 40 to 45 minutes, and I'm going to spend it talking to God. Now, like I said, I get distracted very easily. And so for that 40 to 45 minutes, my mind is bouncing all over the place. I mean, it's going everywhere. And so I'll start out and I'll be thinking about Ruth, and then I'll think about the kids, and then I'll think about church and work and all the things going on at church and work. And then I'll think about the Cowboys and are they going to win today? And my mind kind of starts racing there. And then I go, oh yeah, I'm talking to Jesus here. And so what I started doing is instead of just trying to chastise myself for all these distractions, wherever my mind bounces, that's what I talk to Jesus about. So as I'm thinking about Ruth, I talk to Jesus about Ruth, and I talk to Jesus about my kids. I talk to Jesus about the Cowboys. Come on, Jesus. So what can we do here with the Cowboys? I mean, wherever my mind is bouncing, that's where I spend time talking with Jesus. And I'll read a Bible passage that kind of gets me centered and focused, and then my mind just kind of goes from there. And I've got to tell you, 8 months into this, I love it. Totally different than what I was doing when I was journaling, and journaling was great for me for 20 years, but this is kind of totally unscripted, and I get off the bike energized. I get off the bike with my tank refilled. I get off the bike with a lot of clarity to things in my life that I wasn't sure about before, and I think it's because I'm spending this time talking to Jesus. Now, I'm not at all telling you that you need to get up at 6 in the morning and ride an exercise bike and talk to Jesus for 40 or 45 minutes. That's not at all what I'm saying. But what I am saying, and what Jesus is saying, is you have got to find a place. And you've got to find a way to somehow turn off all the noise of your life, to turn off the noise and just actually sit down and spend time with Jesus. And I don't know what that looks like for you. And again, you say, I don't have 40 minutes to do this, then that's fine. Take 5 minutes, take 10 minutes, start somewhere. And you say, I don't even have a place in my house that's totally quiet. It can be riding in your car. It can be any place. You don't have to carve out a new 10, 15, 40, 45 minutes. It's something you're already doing, but just shut the noise off around you as you're doing whatever you're doing, and then invite Jesus into the conversation wherever your mind is going, whatever is happening, then you invite him into the conversation. It's the only way Jesus says that you're going to get your tank refilled. And again, you may think you don't have the time to do it. Jesus says you can't afford not to do this. We're not talking about a luxury here. And we're not even talking about punishment here. Just like Jesus said to Martha, I'm here for a friendship. He's just here for a relationship. That's what he wants. And so it's not here so that he can beat you up. Let's talk. He says, let's just conversation. Whatever's going on in your life, let's just talk about it. And you may say, I don't even know where, if I were to pick up a Bible, where to start or where to read the Bible. And so one of the things that we have around the church is our reading plans, Bible reading plans. And so we just started here at the beginning of January a plan for 2015. We're calling it Epic this year. And it's just a chapter a day, 6 days a week. And it's just, you just sit down and just read. And the cool thing about Epic is there's thousands of other people reading with you through this plan, same place in the Bible. And what's real cool, actually, about the Bible reading plans, we started doing these maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago. And one of the things that we have done is we started working with the YouVersion app of the Bible. And so you can get that app on your phones, and it's called YouVersion. And Epic is one of the Bible reading plans there. Over the last 5, 6, 7 years, the reading plans that we've been doing as a church, close to 100,000 people have actually taken part in those reading plans. So bigger than just LCBC, but just kind of fun to see that. And so you can do that as well. And so you just read a chapter a day. And as you're reading, what happens to me is I'll just be reading, all of a sudden things start popping out that maybe you never noticed before. And things like this. So maybe you're reading and you come across Jeremiah 29 that says, for I know the plans that I have for you, says the Lord. They're plans for good and not for disaster, to give you a future and a hope. In those days when you pray, I will listen. If you look for me wholeheartedly, you will find me. So first of all, God says, if you'll talk to me, I'll listen. If you look for me, I'll be there. I want this conversation with you. And then the cool part is he says, I've got plans for you, good plans. Not plans for disaster, not plans that are going to hurt you. I've got good plans in mind for you. And so you come across a passage like this. I come across a passage like this. And I'm riding along on my exercise bike, and I start thinking, okay, this is really cool. Because what this tells me is that God has good plans in store for me. And even though things may not seem like it right now, even though I may not feel like it right now, God, you're telling me you've got good plans for me. And so then I start thinking, what does that look like for Ruth? Good plans for me, for Ruth. What does that look like for my kids? What does that look like for LCBC? What does that look like for the Cowboys? God, good plans for the Cowboys. And so I start running through all these different things in my mind and thinking, okay, how does that work in this situation? Or maybe you come across a verse that says this, my thoughts are not like your thoughts, says the Lord. My ways are far beyond what you could imagine. For just as the heavens are higher than the earth, so my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts are higher than your thoughts. And so I read this, and I go, okay, this is interesting, God. What this tells me is you think differently than I do. The way you think is different than the way I think, and that's probably a really good thing. And so, God, even though I may see things a certain way in my life, you're just saying they're different. They're different than what I may possibly understand or think. Or maybe you come across this verse. You parents, This is Jesus talking. You parents, if your children ask for a loaf of bread, do you give them a stone instead? Or if they ask for a fish, do you give them a snake? Of course not, he says. So if you sinful people know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your heavenly Father give good gifts to those who ask him? And I look at this, and again, I'm riding on my bike, and I see something like this, and I go, okay, God. I mean, what you're saying is if me, as a very imperfect dad, want what's good for my kids, what must it look like for you, my heavenly Father, to want to do for me? And what it tells me is I've got this good Father. And even though, again, I may not understand everything you're doing in my life, God, and even though I may not like some of the things that you're doing in my life, you're a good Father. And you're doing what's best for me and best for Ruth and best for the kids. And maybe you come across a verse like this. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will not be afraid, for you're close beside me. Your rod, your staff protect and comfort me. What this tells me is even though I may feel very much alone, I'm not alone. I'm never alone. God is with me, and I'm not alone in whatever situation I'm going through in life. One other, maybe you come across a verse like this, and we know that God causes everything to work together. We know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them. We know that God takes everything that's happening, makes it work out to be something good for those that are following his plan. And I read that, and it kind of reminds me of Southern preacher friend Perry Noble, what he says about this. If it ain't good, God ain't done. And in essence, what he's saying is, if it isn't good yet, God said, I'm going to work everything out for the good. And if it's not good yet, then that means God's not done yet. If it ain't good, it ain't done. And as you sit down and you take a moment and you spend some time with Jesus and you begin to come across some stuff like this, all of a sudden it begins to bring clarity to your life. All of a sudden, you go, okay, I've got some energy here. My tank is being refilled. Now, I understand that this is counterintuitive. I understand it goes against everything that you possibly think or feel because you're feeling exhausted because you've got so many things to do. And so to say somehow, I'm going to peel away and take some time with Jesus, it just doesn't seem to make sense. I'm just telling you from my experience, Jesus says it to Martha and he says it to us. When we pull back and we spend that time with Jesus, our tanks will be refilled. So, I want to take a moment and just pray for each of us. That somehow we'll have the courage to pull back, that somehow we'll have the courage to pull back from the noise, that we'll be able to find that chair, that place, that quiet place, and actually sit down and talk with Jesus. And that when we do, that we'll begin to experience refreshment. When we do, we'll be able to experience replenishment. And so I'm going to pray, and I'm going to invite you to pray with me. And you know, the cool thing is when our tanks are full, we behave differently. And when our tanks are empty, we behave differently. And we're nasty, and we're tough to be around, and everybody around us pays the price for it. When our tanks are full, we're more loving, we're more caring, and we're more considerate of other people. And I would imagine everybody else around that gets the benefit of it. And so you know what my prayer is for us individually, for us as a church, is that this week, as our tanks are refilled, that we become more pleasant people to be around, that people around us notice. And they go, ooh, what's up with her? What's up with him? And we don't necessarily have to say what it is. It's just our tanks are full. We've been with Jesus. And so I'm going to pray, and let's ask God that would be true in our lives. You pray with me. Heavenly Father, God, it's so easy to sit here and feel like we're overwhelmed, we're exhausted. We don't have the time to somehow find a place to pull away and spend time with you. It seems like a luxury, but it's not a luxury, it's a necessity. The only way that our lives are going to be refilled, that our tanks are going to be filled. So God, I ask that even today, that we would mark it on our calendar, that we would put it down on paper, that we wouldn't just think about this, but we would actually do this, that we would actually take time to be with you. How cool it is that we can actually sit and have conversation with the creator of the universe. How cool it is that Jesus would want to spend time with us. And as counterintuitive as it may seem, Father, I pray that you would give us the energy, the courage, the discipline to sit down with Jesus, to open up the Bible and just look for these nuggets about you and look for these nuggets about life and help us understand you and understand life better. And as we do, may our lives change. May our lives be different. May we experience this refreshment and this replenishing and this refilling of our tanks. God, I ask that as we do that, even this week, that as you refill our tanks, that those around us would actually begin to notice, that it would be so noticeable that our wives, that our husbands, that our kids, people at work, people at school, they'd go, man, what's different? Somehow they're different this week. And it's not just a good night's rest. It's the fact that we've been with Jesus and our tanks have been filled. God, may that be true for each of us this week. And I pray in Jesus' name, amen.